to share that with me. So there's a lot of apples that I think a lot of us don't know, and I'm here to share it with you. So Seed Savers used to have an orchard manager. His name was Dan Bussey, and he wrote a 7-volume book describing 16,350 apple varieties, which is crazy, right? We see maybe 5 in the grocery store, and there's actually many. But the thing is that 16,350 is the number that have been on U.S. soil and named since, as far back as we can record. And not all of those are things that are available, and we have some that are really common and some that are lost. We don't really know where they're at or if they still exist. So many of you in your kits might have gotten the apple called Baldwin, and Baldwin has a monument to it in Massachusetts. It's a really interesting apple in that it was found in Massachusetts in 1740, and it really became what everybody was growing. It was kind of the Honeycrisp of the 19th century. And so now in the grocery store, you probably won't find Baldwin, but at one point it was very common. And on the other side of this, you'll see this metal apple, which is Antonovka, and this is another monument. And Antonovka was the rootstock, which is not the one in your kit, but it is rootstocks are part of your kit. Antonovka is a 40-foot tall tree that was used for rootstock for about 100 years. And we don't use it so much anymore because a 40-foot tall tree is very hard to maintain. But these are kind of representations of the 2 parts of your kit and what we're going to be doing today. And in your kit, in the signwood, that all came from our farm. And we have 2 orchards with 978 different trees, which is quite an undertaking. It's about 16 acres. And we're not quite sure how many varieties we have, which maybe we should know, but I'm going to share a little bit more about why it is that we don't know quite how many that we have. And as Jeanine said, we're doing DNA testing, which can clarify a lot of that for us. So at first I showed you the Baldwin apple, which is an apple that was very common. And you can still find it in a lot of nurseries, even though you probably won't find it in the grocery store. But then there's another type of apples. And these are the apples, like I said, that some of them are considered lost. And so maybe 100 people at one point were growing this apple, but over time the trees died and they weren't grafted. And now we don't know if there's any remaining. And an apple like that, on this left-hand side, you'll see the caption, Indian apple trees still standing near the Geneva Experiment Station in 1904. This is an image from a book called Apples of New York, which was really the book that everybody looked to whenever they're talking about apples in the 1900s. And even though this tree was important enough to put a picture in the book, as far as we know, it was never grafted. So this tree is extinct. But there are also some trees that we don't know if they're extinct. Again, they're lost apples. Maybe they exist and maybe they don't. And part of what we do is we try to find those. And
Jamie, can I interrupt you for a second? I apologize. Yeah. Can you get a little bit closer to your mic? Some people are having a little trouble hearing you. And for those hearing an echo, please make sure that you're on mute, and hopefully that will help. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Is this better?
That sounds good to me.
Okay. So yeah, there are also these apples that at one time were widely grafted. But again, maybe the trees died and we don't know much about where they are now. And so that's the list on this right-hand side. And if you know anything about these apples, these are really common in the Midwest at one point or another. We would love to hear from you. But I'm just trying to give you a representation of what's common and what's not common. And again, what Seed Savers is doing to try to find these apples. So historically, the way that you would identify an apple is you would look at it. And believe it or not, these 3 apples are all the same variety, even though they look very different. And there's a man in Maine called John Bunker, And he has been looking at apples and saying what they are for 50 years. And believe it or not, he did not believe that these were the same apple. And so after all that time and study, there's still a level of uncertainty. And so this is an apple that we now know is Salome, but at one point it was also called Benton Red, Collins, and Cherryfield. And again, looking at these, they look very different, but they're actually the exact same apple. But these ones are not the same apple. Even though looking at them, they look almost identical. And russets are notoriously hard to identify. And again, after 50 years, John Bunker, who is really the expert at this, sometimes can't tell these apart. And that's a big problem because we can lose historic apple varieties. And so as a solution to that, the Washington State University has developed a DNA testing program. And this is a really cool program and something that you can participate in if you have an old tree. So the way that it works is that we take leaves from our trees and we put them in these test tubes with silica beads, and they can stay on the shelf almost indefinitely. These ones are from last year and we still have not sent them in, but it's amazing. So you send in these samples to Washington State, and the test costs anywhere from $150 to $50, right? So we're usually paying $50, and essentially they have a big list of apples. And you send in your test and they say, does it match this list? Maybe it doesn't match, right? So they don't know what your apple is. But that's not the end. So if they know what the parent is, then they can try to find out what your apple is. So for example, if I knew your grandma and I knew your mom, maybe I could figure out what your name is. And so that's kind of how the DNA database works. And by sending in these samples, us at Seed Savers are getting a better representation of what we have. So are we accidentally growing 5 Baldwin when we only want to have 2? Or do we have a lost apple that we just didn't know was here? And so this is really revolutionizing apple identification, breeding, and historical research. And so not only are they using the DNA, but people like me and other apple historians, we're getting sent the data and they say, this apple has this parent and this child, what do you think it is? And so it's really a collaborative effort to identify and confirm. And so once you get the answer of what your apple is, you can feel pretty confident that it's correct. And again, this is open to the public and it's an amazing program. And by adding your apple to the database, you're expanding the public knowledge and what we are able to know. And again, what's really cool is that not only can they tell you the name, but I recently sent in an apple and we didn't know what it was. And they said, well, we don't know either, but it's older than 1870, it's yellow with red stripes, and it's late season. And I have never seen this apple, but they could tell me all of that from the DNA test. So again, what can you do? Well, the first thing is to be a steward, which is what we're all going to be doing this weekend by grafting these trees. Even if you got an apple like Baldwin, I'm sure you got a lot of other ones too, but Baldwin is considered a quite common historic variety. But what I'm continuously told is it's there until it's not. So even though Baldwin isn't extremely rare, it's whenever we forget about how important it is to keep track of those maybe common or more common historic varieties that then they become lost. And so by being a steward, you're doing a lot to help this entire apple preservation mission. But we're also looking for other people like sleuths, historians, old timers, and anybody who knows where old apples are. And we want to get you involved. And the apple community is amazing because if you want to be involved, everybody wants you there. You will be on email chains, we'll be sending you stuff, you'll be sending us stuff, and it's really a nice collaborative community. So first step is grafting some trees, and we hope you want to get a little bit more involved in the future. All right, I'll pass it back over to Jeanine.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. As I said before, Jamie is our orchard manager, She and our orchard assistant, Zach, who you'll meet tomorrow, collected all of the scion that was sent out to you in your kits. And so next I'm going to pull up a short video about collecting scion to see how that's done. While I'm getting that video ready, I am actually going to launch this little poll to see how many of you, I'm curious how many of you have grafted before and how many of you have an apple tree that's special to you that you might want to propagate. We'll also give that a minute just to see what's going on. All right, thanks for sharing that. Looks like a couple more answers are getting in. Okay. Thanks so much. It looks like about a third of you have grafted before, and about half of you have some apple tree that's really special to you. So thanks, that's great information for us to know. And you'll learn more here about what to do about wanting to propagate those. So here is collecting scion.
So I'm out here in the orchard today and we're going to collect scion wood. That's the grafting material off of this tree, so we get a copy of the same tree. It's late February today. This is kind of the time frame. The wood has to still be dormant to do this grafting properly. So in Iowa here we do it February, March, sometimes into April. The critical part is you have to have a few weeks for the graft union to heal a little bit before you plant it out in the garden, and that's going to be around your frost-free date, so you can work back from there. Okay, I'm standing here in a rather old tree, and I want to show you some different parts of the tree. If you look up here, I've got a stem that is it's old growth. There's flower buds all over it, and there's very little new growth. We have to do our grafting with young, new growth. So there's nothing on this branch that would help us. Now, on an old tree like this, I often look back in the middle of it, and here I find a shoot that's vigorous and upright. Some people call them sucker shoots or water shoots. This one actually has a couple years growth on it, and I'll show you that. It came from this part of the tree. Here's actually 3-year-old wood. It's got spurs on it, and those hold flower buds, and we do not want our new graft to sprout out with flowers. We want leaves. Here's another section of new growth from last year. Well, it'd be from 2 years ago. And now here, I'm going to take this off. Right here is last year's terminal bud scar, and this shoot came out last summer, and that's what we want. It's brighter red. Sometimes they're yellowish, but often reddish. It's smooth, kind of glossy, and out toward the tip a little bit fuzzy growth. So that's what I'm looking for. Now, the size of the wood I want is determined a little bit by the rootstock I'm going to put this on, and it's really wonderful to match the diameter of your rootstock with the diameter of the scion wood. You can use scion wood that's smaller than your rootstock, but you can't use scion wood that's larger than your rootstock. For this workshop coming up, you're going to have rootstocks that are measured at 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take this whole cutting here, and I can make a new tree out of every 2-inch section of this. But just so I can store it easily, I'm going to cut it in half. And I'm going to put these in a plastic bag wrapped in damp, not wet, but damp paper towel. And I can store this in the refrigerator anywhere a few degrees above freezing, like 34 to 42, something like that is wonderful for it, and I can store it for weeks that way.
Right. All right, can you still hear me? I'm having a little glitch in the computer. Okay, good. Excuse me. So that was a brief view of what it means to collect cyanwood. And again, thanks to Jamie and Zach, excuse me, for collecting all of the cyanwood in the kits. So sorry. And remember, this is something that you can do, any of you can do if you have an apple tree that's special to you that you want to propagate. So now it's time for me to introduce you to Seed Savers Exchange Orchard and horticultural advisor, Lindsay Lee. Lindsay was actually the Seed Savers on the Seed Savers grafting team. He was a team leader in 1989 when we first planted trees in our heritage orchard. And he's been connected to Seed Savers and our orchards ever since. Lindsay, thanks so much for joining us. Let me hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is my audio pretty good?
Sounds
Okay.
great.
Yeah, I've been very privileged to be a part of this project since its beginnings. I was simply a nursery worker in those days and had the grafting skills that I learned on the job. So when Kent Whaley was looking for a grafting team to start this orchard, I was at hand, easily accessible. So that's what we do. Before I go any farther, I want to send a shout out to Jamie and her assistant Zach, just because you should know they're doing a terrific job. I stepped in a few years ago and managed the orchard here for 4 years. It's no small undertaking, and they're doing a really wonderful job with it. So kudos to those two. Otherwise, I just am a neighbor of Heritage Farm here. I live up the road a few miles and have run my own nursery for 30 years. I've been in the horticulture, landscape horticulture trade for 50 plus years. And as a result of that, this is a little aside. As a result of that, I've spent a lot of my life outdoors, and I know I've got an audience of gardeners here. You might notice a little reddening in my cheeks. I'm currently treating my face with a cream that will cause my skin to shed. I see some nodding heads here. It's just a preventative thing, so I can try to avoid skin cancer. But it's a bit of a hassle. And so for everybody here, all I'm trying to say is get a broad brimmed hat and put that sunscreen on so you don't have to go through this. It's a little bit of a hassle. What's coming up is a skill. And like any skill, you need to do it a while and develop that skill. I'm not going to pretend that this is an easy thing. It is it's a practice, and practice is the key word here. We send practice wood in these kits, and that's for a reason. If you can take this stick, doesn't have a name on it, doesn't owe you anything, it's not precious, and you can practice until you start making good cuts. And then when you feel comfortable with that, you can pick up your rootstocks and cyanwood and make your grafts. And we want, when you do that, to already be a little bit accomplished at it, so you can do a good job when you do. We find that people have really good success rates with this, but it's key that you apply yourself a little bit and use up this practice wood. If you feel like you need more, you can practice on a dogwood shrub from outside your door, or a piece of anything. Whether it's a pussy willow, hopefully something softwood, pussy willow or dogwood, or viburnum or a hydrangea. Hydrangeas would be quite soft. Anyway, let's watch the next video, and then we'll have a lot of time to have Q&A. Okay.
We're ready to make our graft union. This is a piece of cyanwood that came in your kit. Look at the buds. They're triangular in shape and they should point up. It's very important. If we put this on upside down, it won't grow. So those buds have to be pointing away from the rootstock. This is your grafting knife, and it's a very sharp implement. And I'm going to teach you how to use it where it would be really hard to cut yourself. That's something we really want to avoid today. It has a flat side and a beveled side. The flat side should be facing you as if you're looking in a hand mirror. I'm going to put my thumb right against the blade. From the side, that's not ever going to cut me. No matter how, it's when I move back and forth against that blade that I'll cut myself. We've provided in your kit a little thumb cot that's a protector. It's not absolute, but it'll help prevent cuts. I find that when I do a lot of this, I whittle away at my thumb a little bit. So this would be nice to keep a little skin left on. Okay, so to make the cut, keep your elbows fastened to your body. The less we have movement in our hands, the more accurate we'll be. If I do this work out away from my body, I have less control. There's more movement. Right up here, I have the most control and the most power that I can put into this cut. So to make it, put your thumb here. Now put the cyanwood in between the thumb and the knife. I tilt the knife a little bit and then angle it. The angle there is going to determine the angle you go through the wood. Now, the trick is, don't move your dominant hand that's holding the knife. Move the hand that's holding the cyanwood. Okay? Now I just pulled a little bark off there. I might put the knife at a little more angle and a little more force with my thumb and pull that wood through, and look, all my thumb is doing is coming in to rest against the side of the blade. Now, common mistakes, if you're afraid of that blade and you don't put your thumb there, you're going to get a little tongue on the end of this. That's not good. That is too thin. I really want a flat surface all the way to the tip. And I want a flat surface this way too. If we've whittled away at it and we have something that looks like a potato chip, it's not going to come in good contact with the rootstock. So we want very flat surfaces. We also want them to be 3 times the diameter of the wood long. You see that? This is just a scrap of cyanwood, and this is at least 3 times the diameter, and it can be more than, shouldn't be less. The reason being is when we fasten this to the rootstock, we wrap tape around it, and we want it to pull them together. If I have too sharp an angle, it'll push them apart. You'll see that later. Okay, this is a good cut. The next thing is to cut the rootstock. The diameters, the whip and tongue graft is used on rootstock and scionwoods that match in diameter. So you see here, I'm a good 10 inches up from the root, and that's okay, but right in here I'm going to make my cut on the rootstock. That's a little short, not a problem. If I just come back here and peel away at the heel and do a little whittling, I can end up with a nice, flat, even taper. So I've got those both the same length, and we judged them to be the same width to begin with, so I think they're gonna fit together quite nicely. We can be a little bit undersized with the scionwood. We cannot be oversized with it. If it hangs out the edges, it won't take. The next thing, we call this a whip and tongue graft. The next step is the tongue cut. What I do for this, I set this on the table for this maneuver, and I use my knife to visualize center. Then I move back about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 even, and I like to just wiggle the knife and apply some sideways pressure. Now this is counterintuitive to a lot of people because look, my fingers are here and I'm pushing that way. So be careful, push a little pressure, and then when you're in a ways, pull that up and open this cut. Can you see that from the side? It's ready to receive its pairing. So we do the same thing on the rootstock. I find center, I move out a little bit, and I'm trying here not to split with the grain. I am cutting back into the wood. So I've got 2 tongue cuts made opposite each other. I can fit those together, push them together, and there we have a graft union that will grow together. The more closely these fit, the more closely they align, the higher percentage of take you're going to have. So practice a little bit, use up that practice wood we sent along, get good at this cut, and you'll be able to make graft unions with the pros. The next step is to wrap it in your kit. Some of this tape came. This is a stretchy, paraffin-based, wax-based tape, and you simply hold it on your rootstock with a finger, stretch it, and once it's trapped, once you've gone once around, you can really stretch this out and wrap and pull that really tight. Once I've gone over the whole graft, I turn it around, come back down, and before you're done, before you lose a little bit to work with, I pull it tight and rip the end off. What that does is seals it against itself. It's waxy, so it kind of sticks to itself. Now, I've got a bud here and a bud here. I don't need more than that on there, so I'm going to take that off. Cut it just, 1/8, 1/4 inch above the top bud. When these start to grow, there's even one here, 2, 3 buds on there. That's plenty. You're going to end up choosing one of them. But there you have a whip and tongue graft. Now, we're going to go on. Maybe I have rootstock or scionwood that's too small for the rootstock I have. So here I have a nice big fat rootstock. There's a couple little twigs on there. And for this, so there's no place on here where I can line this up that the two are the same size. So I'm going to choose the place I want to put it. That's up about 8-10 inches from the root. And I cut that off square. Next, I'm going to make the cut on the, well, I'm going to make the cut on the cyanwood first because I need to know how long it is. Okay, so here we go. See, I didn't have pressure behind here, so I have a tail. I take that off. Let's make one more. Oh. Yeah, nice and flat. Okay, this one I still make a tongue cut. Open it up. Now, by simply holding these side by side, I can tell how long this cut needs to be. And using the other side of the knife, the tapered side now, down, I slice this off until I get the same width as my cyanwood. Okay, I've got that. Again, I find center. I go back just a little bit. I make that tongue cut. And slide them together. The tongue cut is really there to keep those two hanging on to each other until I get the wrapper on. How's that? So again, it's a nice tight fit. The only difference is I have this stump end. We'll be able to cover that with the wrapping tape. It's called budding tape, but we use it in the summer for bud grafting. So again, stretch this out and trap the first tail of it and keep wrapping, pulling it tight, stretching out the wrapper. Oh, I tore it a little bit, but then I'm going back down over myself and then break it off. This kind of seals up the end of that stump, and there you go. You have a side graft tree as well as the whip and tongue. Okay.
All right. Well, there you have it, how to bench graft. Lindsay, is there anything else you'd like to say before we go to Q&A?
Here, I'll stand up and hold this up so you can see a little bit. Something that's not perfectly clear in that. Here I've got buds on this piece of wood. And you want to work on a nice clean stretch that's on, you can do it with a bud sticking out the side of your graft union, but I prefer to either just take that lowest bud off or go to the back side. And here I've got, good heavens, I've got 2 inches there that's just smooth bark. The other thing is, this thing about holding your arms close to your body, if I actually connect my dominant hand, arm, elbow to wrist to my body, I'm almost able to do this work with my shoulder muscles. They're stronger than my hands. And you don't have to make this cut in one swipe. You can literally just peel the bark off and then take thin slices. If you take a thin slice, there's not much behind it to make it a stiff piece of wood. I don't know if that's coming out clear, but a thin slice is easier to remove than a big hunk of wood. So if you're having a little challenge with just arm strength, try taking thin shavings off until you get that nice sharp point. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. So we are to our Q&A portion of this session. So if anyone has any questions about any of this, there are 2 ways to ask them. One is you can type that into the chat and I'll read it aloud. and Lindsay or Jamie, if it's a question for Jamie, can answer that question. Or if you would like to speak aloud, feel free to do that by raising your hand. And in Zoom, to raise your hand, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something called reactions. If you click on reactions, one of the things is raise hand. There's a little icon. If you press that, then Zoom will tell me that your hand is raised and I can call on you. Excuse me. So go ahead and ask any questions you have. We did have one question that came through for Jamie already. Jamie, do you know the difference between the $50 simple test and the $400 testing that's available for universities for DNA testing?
Yeah, so there's a few different universities doing DNA testing, and the ones that I'm most familiar with is Washington State, which is what we talked about, and also University of California. And University of California is $410, I believe, but they're not specializing in apples. They're doing pecans, they're doing all kinds of trees. Washington State has really made the process like a bulk. They're doing a lot of tests. And so the $50 only tells you the name. So if it matches something in the database, you know that. And then the $150 test tells you what the parents are. And so if you pay $150, even if they don't know what your tree is, they can say, well, the parent is Baldwin and Pinus. And so that's kind of the pricing difference, is that Washington State is really specialized and is doing a lot of tests. And people like University of California are doing a lot of different types of trees, but not so many of one type, so it costs more.
Great, thank you. Jamie, another question I think you can take here. Do you know what variety of cyanwood, how do people know what variety of cyanwood they received in their kit?
Yeah, so you have two different bundles. One bundle is practice wood, so you won't find any tags on that. And that's kind of whatever we could find in the orchard. So I wouldn't use that to actually graft a tree. It might grow into something, but we also did collect root shoots, so it could be rootstock. And then the other bag says historic varieties on it, and everything in that bag should have a tag on it, and the tag will tell you what variety it is.
Great. Another question for you, Jamie. Where can someone find the list of trees that we have here in the orchard, and does Seed Savers sell scion?
Yeah, so if you're looking to buy scionwood, the best place to look is the exchange. So that's exchange.seedsavers.org. And that's kind of like Craigslist for seeds and scionwood is how I like to describe it. And so anything that we're selling is on there, and you'll see the description and what we have. In terms of a full list, it's not publicly available, but I will email it to you if you'd like to see it. So you can send me an email.
Great. And let me just put Jamie's email address here in the chat. And then you'll have that so you can email Jamie directly. Andrea, it looks like you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm super excited. I actually was gifted apple trees from Seed Savers Exchange back in 2017. They were purchased, planted in 2018. Two varieties. I don't know which one is which. I know the varieties, but I don't know which tree is which. But actually one of them accidentally got mowed over. So I actually kept the rootstock, like I kept the rootstock growing. And I just wanted to know, how would I harvest rootstock from, I think it was M7 that you were using to graft those trees back when you were sending trees. Correct me if I'm wrong. And is it possible to take rootstock from that and then use scions off the other tree to graft to that? And how does that, do I have to wait a year after collecting, or how does that kind of work?
Lindsay, I'll let you take this one.
Yes. Okay, you're lucky in that you have a list of two varieties. So when your one remaining tree produces, I think you'll be able to find descriptions of those two apples and compare them. And I don't think it'll be hard at all to identify which variety you have. That's a lot cheaper than doing a DNA test on them.
Can I tell you my beginner mistake with that? I chose two varieties that have apples at different times.
Yeah.
That also means they bloom at different times, so they are not great at pollinating each other. So I think I'll be able to figure it out from that too.
Yes. Well, my answer on pollination for home orchardists is it's pretty rare to plant an apple tree that doesn't have another apple tree within a half a mile of it. So any other mollusk species will pollinate your fruit, and it doesn't have to be a domestic apple. It can be the neighbor's crabapple. If you don't have other mollusk trees within the flight distance of a pollinating insect, you're living in a pretty remote place. The question of rootstocks comes up every year, so I might as well tackle that. It's the rootstocks you're working with today. They're called M7. That's considered a semi-dwarf tree. It produces a tree that's about half the size of a standard tree. So when a standard might grow 30 feet tall, your M7s would produce a 15-foot tall tree. This is all subject to how you prune it too. So if you just let them grow, they might get a little taller. If you work on them, like I do, I have standard trees in my orchard, but they're barely taller than I am, but I'm a kind of a maniacal pruner. The rootstock itself has come from a company that grows it by cloning it, by growing a stool block. If you've ever cut a weed tree off in your garden and had it just branch out, well, this is what they do intentionally with apple rootstocks. They plant and establish the seedling trees, the rootstocks, and then those grow. Once they're established, they cut them off. Pre-season, they cut them off at the ground. They branch out. They'll send out the first year 3-4 shoots. In the 10th year, they'd send out 30 shoots. And what they do is pile rich material like compost, or I'm guessing on large scale they use somewhat composted sawdust or something like that. Anything that the roots would grow out into. They pile that around the base of this little bush of apple shoots and for the summer, and the tree, the shoots will go, hey, there's medium here. They'll send out roots into that, and then we can go back in late in the fall once they've gone dormant. Or a lot of these are grown in the Pacific Northwest and they harvest in the spring, but you can cut those off right at ground level, and you've got little shoots with little roots. And if you look, I'll pull one out. It's just a stem with roots on it, but you can see a cut end right here. This was attached to a stool block, is what you call it. And good heavens, I see a little white hair root coming off the base of this. It's already wanting to grow. So you can do that at home. So if you have a tree that fails, you can establish a stool block and have, I did this for a few years at home, and I was getting 9 or 10 shoots a year. And I would just, wait until they got a foot tall, and I'd heap soil, composty soil around it for the summer. And then in the fall, I'd harvest them and put them in my root cellar and graft them in the late winter. And you have your own little system there. They're pretty easy to buy, and just mail order them if you don't want to go through that. But they're also, if you have a stool block, if you have a leftover rootstock, you can turn it into a stool block. If you don't want to do that and you want to graft that tree, I would let it grow up and until it's got inch and a half diameter to it, and there's a process called top working where you can graft a piece on right out in the field. That's not necessarily part of this program. We're teaching bench grafting today, but it's not too hard to find information about it. And maybe one day we'll add that into our apple grafting sessions. But I have done that on some trees in my own place where the graft failed, and you know, more for me, it's more likely that the deer removed the shoot, but I had a live root, so I let it grow up and grafted on top of it later.
Excuse me. Lindsay, can you also mention a little bit more about matching the rootstock to the scion, why you would choose certain rootstock, and the life expectancy of a standard tree compared to dwarf or semi-dwarf?
Okay. Rootstocks, in part, the biggest thing we choose by choosing a rootstock is the size. So there's dwarf trees, dwarf roots that will produce a tree that might be a maximum of 8 feet tall. And with pruning, it could be 6, you know, so you're never using a ladder. And then, you know, all the way to standard. On a standard tree, like an Antonovka root, you can plant up 40 feet apart, and 40 trees would fill an acre. On modern orcharding, on a dwarf rootstock, they're planting in rows and trellising them with trees at 3 feet apart, and you can put 1,500 trees on an acre. It's a whole different look, a whole different method, but it produces a lot more fruit per acre. It's kind of an exciting thing to me. And now with grafting skills, you'd be able to order a bundle of dwarf rootstocks and make your own trellis orchard if you'd like, if you have a small space but still want 30 trees. That can be done. What else did you want in there?
I think that answered that question. I have another question coming in from Jono asking, besides the rootstock type, does the soil type affect the spacing of the planting for the trees? For instance, planting these M7s in sand or gravel-like soil.
All right. Yeah. An M7 is probably the smallest rootstock that you can use that is considered self-supporting. So I can plant an M7. That's why we use it, really. I can plant it. It doesn't need staking. We get smaller than that, and you know, a dwarf root system, a dwarf root variety is simply a little more wimpy. It's not as vigorous, and so it doesn't grow as big a tree. Well, it also doesn't grow as strong a root system or sturdy a trunk. So we have to support the dwarf trees. That's why they're being grown on trellises, or if you have a tree that's, maybe it's a tree that's 35 or 40% of standard, you could grow it on a stake, post it, but it needs some help staying standing. There's a lot of other attributes that rootstocks bring, and if you read descriptions of them, they're not too hard to find on the internet. You can get rootstocks that are extremely cold hardy. You can get rootstocks that impart things like disease resistance or insect resistance, and stuff like that. So, and soil adaptability. Some will say they're better adapted to light soils, or will tolerate heavy soils. So I would read up on those.
And
M7 is kind of a generalist. I've not seen it fail in many situations. So.
And Helen is reminding me, I did miss part of that question, which is, can you talk for a second about the life expectancy
of
the different rootstocks?
Right. Dwarf stocks don't live as long. And you see some of these historic photos of ancient old trees, and they can be 100 years old easily. A big standard can live that long, and I've never seen a big old standard tree that was well cared for that 100 years, so they're always a little rough. But a dwarf tree, the commercial orchards that are doing the high density plantings, they're gonna cycle those through in about 10 years, 15 years of production out of a true dwarf tree. You're gonna see decline, no matter what you do. I mean, I give them the best care, that they'll last longer that way. I recently was hiking with some friends in a woodland, and we came upon signs of an old homestead. And there in the woods near it was an ancient old apple tree. I swear it had a 24-inch diameter trunk. And I can't imagine how old that tree had been. It was no longer living. I intend to check it this spring and make sure there's not a shoot on it. But it didn't look like there would be. But I'm just, just think about what that tree has seen.
Yeah. And Helen's also saying here, advice, order rootstock early, which is true. A lot of times rootstock can be sold out by the spring. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Right. When we have quantities we need, I'd like to say order that in August.
Yeah. Yeah. And we always order ours in the fall for this class for sure. Let's talk about cyanwood a little bit. When you mentioned that the cyanwood needs to be dormant when collected, when would you consider it to be too late to collect cyanwood?
Well, we've had a warm winter here in Iowa in zone 5B, 4B, and there's actually a little green tip happening now. So a lot of apple buds have swollen. I wouldn't try it much past this. If they're swollen but not open, I'm okay trying it. If they're open and green, I guess I'd still try it. The more advanced that leaf gets, the harder it is going to be to pull it off. If it's just showing a little green tip, then I think you could probably do it. But in that instance, I would do the whole healing process at a pretty cool temperature and just keep it longer, and so that it doesn't continue to leaf out while it's healing.
And just a reminder that you all received the advice about what to do for the healing time, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow as well, but that's a really important part of grafting. Is the practice wood that we sent out also apple wood? Will it feel the same as the scion wood? Yes, it will. I'll just answer that quickly. It is also apple wood, and it should feel the same. Are crab apples propagated the same way? And if we find an apple tree that we want to propagate, what do we graft it to?
Crab apples it's all the species. The genus is Malus. And so the species would be Domestica, so domesticated Malus. It doesn't matter what size the apple is. It's all the same genus, and they'll all work together. That said, I'm sure there'll be questions about it. If you have a pear, the pears can be done the same way, but they have to go onto a pyrus rootstock, a pear rootstock. You can't go combining two genuses in this way. Yeah, and stone fruit too. Prunus, the plum and cherry family, they all have to go on the prunus roots. Is that it?
Yeah, thank you. And here's another question that we often get. Is it possible to graft multiple varieties of apples onto an older existing tree?
Yes, it's done all the time. Some nurseries sell 3 or 4 or 5-in-1s. the trick with that, especially if you're grafting on the small trees, all these varieties have different growth rates. And so to put a Melinda, which grows like a weed, on with something else that grows slower, you're going to have a pretty lopsided tree, but almost no matter what you do. So you really should know your varieties pretty darn well when you start doing that. Now that said, I've got an established tree at home that I took a limb off this winter, and I'm pretty tempted to stick another variety on that by essentially top working that stem in the middle of that. With an established tree, I could stick something else in there, and I just ended up having one branch in the tree that had a different apple on it. When we first grafted the Seed Saver collection in '89, we had a fair number of trees that were donated from a collector in the Chicago area who had a small yard, and he had one tree, and I think he had 30 or more varieties on that tree. Now that's not a production model. That's simply a way to preserve some scionwood, for what it's worth.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have some questions about the actual grafting. The first question we have is, for the graft, should we avoid having a bud within the cut on the scionwood?
Yeah, I tried to mention that when I was demonstrating a little bit ago, but sometimes, yeah, I would try to, and that bud can be right down near the tip if it's on the back side, or just turn it over and take it off. If it's on the side, I mean, it'll still work. If you get 95%, 90 even percent of these cambium layers matched up, your graft is going to work. But why not make it 100%? It's going to be even a better chance if you have 100% of that matched up. So if you've got a bud on the side, you kind of got an irregular shape instead of this nice clean ellipse that you get when you diagonally slice this stem.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. How do you feel about the idea of making multiple side grafts to see which one takes?
I think you're lacking confidence. I think you need to just put one on there and say good things to it, and follow our instructions. Store it well. They'll grow. We got really high percentages out of this method. In top working, if I go home this evening, I could top work. We always say to top work when the first dandelion blooms. So I could go home now and top work a tree. And that I'll put, depends on the size of the diameter of the tree, I'll put 3, 4, 5 stems on it. Most of those will still take, but at least I've got averages. I've had a few that where only one took, and then we grow with that.
Great. And you may have already said this, but I'll go ahead and ask, if you make a cut on the rootstock a little too long and you have more green exposed than your scionwood will cover, does that hurt the chances of the graft taking?
Okay, so what I think that's saying, if you've made, we say in the video to make your graft 3 times the diameter long. That to me is a minimum. I could make it 3 inches long as I got them to match up. So that means I need a longer cut on my scionwood. So if you have, or you can shorten, let me say this is my rootstock, and I've got a very long cut on it. Now that's not too long. I could cut my scionwood to fit it. but I can also, you know, shave the tip of it down and get a shorter slice, shorter ellipse. Okay,
Great, thank you.
I gotta put my.
We have
laptop
someone
back
here. Sorry, were you still going?
on. Oh, no.
Okay. We have someone here who says they've been using an Omega grafting tool. What do you feel are the pros and cons of a knife versus the Omega tool?
Okay, I have opinions. I love handwork. So I think this is a very simple tool. It's relatively inexpensive, and I can make many orchards with it. We have a grafting tool here. It's like a big pair of pliers, and you cut the stem, and it makes a cut for you. I find that the blades in those are they get dull, and if as soon as you've done X number of grafts with it, you've got a duller blade. They're nearly impossible to sharpen, so you just put new ones in. And so you just kind of continually put new blades in it. It's not cheap. And I know some, you know, I'm afraid I wouldn't even consider it if I was doing large scale production work. This knife is easily sharpened. It takes me a minute and a half to do a graft, even doing my own taping, and you know, how many trees are you going to make? So I don't like them. I think that they're expensive little toy.
All right. Next question is, do you do anything to keep the top of the graft from drying out? I see grafting wax is sold some places.
Right. Yeah, it wouldn't hurt. In the old days, we didn't use this parafilm. We used a grafting rubber, just a little strip of rubber band, and you wrap that around. Well, this wasn't really airtight, and we'd end up either dipping the whole tree or painting it with melted wax to seal it all up. And in those days, we'd just dab a little on the tip. I usually don't even bother with it. If you're concerned about it, anything, you know, a little bit of, you know, you could burn a candle for a minute and have a little pool of wax there. Let it cool. The wax shouldn't be hot. It should be starting to form a film on it. You could dip the tip of that in candle wax, little beeswax. You could even just rub beeswax on the end to seal that. It's I do it mostly without sealing the tip of the cyanwood, but you know, it's, my wife has an expression. It's called both belt and suspenders. So you can go ahead and seal that up in any way you want to. But like I say, a little candle wax would do it. A little beeswax. Just don't you know, when I'm doing top working, I have a whole double boiler full of grafting wax, and I melt that, and then I let it sit there on the tailgate cooling until I can stick my finger in it and it doesn't hurt. You know, I want it just about solid again.
Great. I have a question here, and this was a while ago, so whoever wrote this, if I'm not saying it correctly, please chime in. But someone has a tree they want to propagate that's 9 to 10 years old. The cyanwood is very small in diameter, and they're asking, would the side graft work, or does the tree need to be larger before this will work? So I think just asking if the side graft is the appropriate graft for that.
Side grafts work very well. more often than not, I've had to employ it when I'm trying to graft an old tree that's hardly putting out any new growth at all. And we can get a piece that's 3 inches long and about the size of a spaghetti noodle. And you can still make a graft with that, but you need the side graft method. So it's less often you know, with a young tree, you can try it now. The good thing is it's just going to keep growing, and in a year or two, you're going to have nice bigger stuff to work with. On that note, something I've done before, talking about saving an old tree, and it's something I've been asked to do a lot. If you've got an old tree and there's just no good usable new growth of any size on it, you can do what I call a drastic measure and take a pruning saw and take a limb off. If it's a live limb, it'll respond by putting out a whole bunch of new growth, and that the following year would make good grafting wood.
Yeah. And can you just talk a little bit more? I have a couple of questions here about, if it's too late now to take scion, can I do it next year? What's the best thing to do if a tree is really old and you're worried about its survival, and it's too late in the season?
Right. Like I said earlier, if it's showing much green, I think you've missed the window. And we have to kind of, in organizing this class, we have to kind of hit the middle of the season for the whole country. We have people in the south and people in the north and that still have a foot of snow on the ground, and people in the south that have red buds blooming. If you're in the south end, southern part of the United States, your trees are probably leafed out, probably a little far along. For any region, if I think about it and want to go collect scion wood on some nice February day, I can collect them. I can wrap them up in damp paper, put them in a baggie, seal that up tight, roll it up, get the air out of it, and put them in the back of the fridge. And you can, a few years ago, I collected scion wood like that for a friend who was establishing an orchard, and another nearby orchard was going out of business and they were going to bulldoze their trees. We collected scion wood off of those varieties in October and bundled them up, wrapped them up, kept them damp. I actually put those down in my root cellar, which is a nice, humid, even temperature, cool. And we grafted those trees in late February. We grafted those onto rootstocks in late February, planted them out that next spring. I think he made a couple thousand trees out of them, and it worked very well. So we had those stored for the whole winter.
I have a question that came in about that. Do you need to worry about mold when you're storing scion wood for that long?
Yeah, but a lot, without air, there's not going to be much mold. So if I'm storing them in a plastic bag, I often use newspaper. I'll just wet a couple sheets of newspaper, lay my scion wood on it. And it should be damp. It should be wet, not soggy. You shouldn't be able to wring water out of it. That's too wet. But I roll those up like a burrito, roll them up tight, fold the ends in, put them in a baggie, roll that up so I'm pushing all the air out of it, seal it, put them in the fridge. Below 45 degrees, they're not going to mold for months. Another thing I do, I've got a root cellar. I use it a lot for stuff like this, and we'll put cuttings down there, and I'll make bundles of cuttings, and I'll use like an old nursery container or something, and I'll bury them in damp sand. And good, clean, damp sand from the quarry it is nice stuff horticulturally, and that has a really even moisture all winter long. I hardly have to look at them. I mean, I check them a time or two in the winter and make sure there's still some moisture. But I bury them in damp sand, and I might lay something plastic over the top of that bucket, so that they don't transpire moisture. But that works really well. And in contact with the sand, sometimes they sprout a root. Not always, but they come out of that very nicely. You could literally, depending on the region you live in, but you could dig a deep hole in the garden and put them down in the soil for the winter. I'd fill that back with something easy to dig in, but I met a guy years ago that made grape cuttings, and just by burying them in the soil for the winter, he put them down about 30 inches and left them there over winter, and stuck his cuttings in the spring.
I have a couple of questions coming in about wondering if you could do that with rootstock.
Yes.
Okay.
When I've grown my own rootstocks, I've harvested those in the fall and then put them in the root cellar for the winter, just in a bucket of sand. Just anything to keep moisture on those roots.
Great. Are there any apple varieties that are not suitable for grafting?
I don't know of any. Some apple varieties have a tendency, can come true from seed. I have seen some Antonovka. Antonovka is used for rootstocks for standard trees, but it was brought here as an apple variety. It produces a big yellow summer apple. And I've seen those offered before as seedling grown. Back when I worked in a wholesale nursery, we were producing crab apples, for people's yards, and we just collected apple seed and grew them out in a row, and used those because we didn't care about the rootstock. And you would pretty much get standard trees doing that, but you wouldn't know a thing about the root.
Right. All right, I have a question here from Linda, and then we'll get to you, Paul. I see your hand is raised. Linda says that they have a tree that a rabbit girdled, 2 trees that the rabbit girdled about a month ago. Would it be possible to salvage scion wood from these trees? Linda's in Eastern Colorado Plains, Zone 5.
Okay. Yes, you can harvest, but I bet in Zone 5 you're starting to break bud. So get those off right away and regraft. Another thing you can do, there's a thing called bridge grafting, where a girdled tree, and this is usually done, it's a lot of work, but you can save a tree, often done with historic trees. So you basically make a grafting cut at both ends of and you can even use a water chute like this, and you attach and you cut around it at the top and bottom, and in the middle here is where the rabbit ate. And you put, depending on the size of the tree, you put one every 2 inches around the base of the tree, and you can bridge that damage. And so it's a bunch of work. It's kind of fun to try. We've done it here. That we've got a little fruit growing group, and a number of years ago, one of our members had a lot of rabbit damage, and I wasn't there, but they got busy and did bridge grafts on a bunch of his trees, and most of them survived it.
Yeah, that's exciting. Paul, I see you have your hand raised. Excuse me, could you unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
I just a continuation on the last one. I have trees I planted orchard about 5 years ago, and I have 2 years, not this last winter, but the winter before, there was enough snow that rabbits got in there over the winter and girdled the trees. I took scion wood off the tops of the girdled trees and put it in the root cellar, but then I was sick all spring, so I never got anything done. So now I have about, well, 14, I know, probably more like 20 trees, that some of which I got a couple of them put growth up from above the original graft. Those trees are about 4 inches in diameter or so. They were too big for me to put my rabbit protectors around. But and that, so some I can get some scion wood off the growth that came from above the graft on some of the trees, but a bunch of them have shoots coming up from the rootstock. Can I graft onto those shoots coming from the rootstock and end up with a decent tree in the long term? And also what time? The information I have talks about slippery or slipping, when the bark slips to do your grafts in. And I don't know what he's talking about.
Okay. So yes, if you've got shoots coming from above the graft, they're the variety you want, and that would be good material to use for grafting. Shoots coming from the root are rootstock, and you can graft onto those. I'd limit it to one. Excuse me.
Sorry, while Lindy's taking that little break, I want to mention we have 10 minutes left. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I am kind of skipping over the questions that are about next steps and planting and things like that, because we will cover that in depth tomorrow. So if you have those questions, I'm copying onto my document here, but we'll wait till tomorrow to get to that. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Okay, if I've got multiple shoots coming from the root, I try to cut it back to where I just have one. And then you would grow it up so it's big enough in size to top work it. Top working, what you're referring to when the bark slips, that's really a summertime thing, and that's not a good time to top work. We do top working that for us right about this time of year when the first dandelion blooms. I use a method called a bark graft. I don't have to split the top of the stem. I just make a cut in the bark, and I've whittled a little stick that I use to pilot open that bark a little bit, and then I'm just making the same kind of cut I do on this scion wood and sliding it in behind the bark. And again, I think you can find visuals on that online. We're not teaching it here necessarily, but it's a pretty easy method. But you will need to melt some wax, and once this is in, you seal everything you can find up, because this will be right inside the bark. It made me think. Somebody just told me there's a new product that's just kind of a workable putty-like stuff that you can pack around here. No, you don't have to melt stuff anymore.
Great. I have a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So letting them go, because that was 2 years ago that they got girdled, and so they've got the growth from last summer. So some of those shoots that are coming up from the rootstock would be the right size for the same kind of graft we're using here. Rather than, I was going to do bark inlay grafts, but then being sick last spring, I didn't get it done.
Right. Well, if you've got a diameter the size of your scion wood, you could try it outdoors, just in place right now. It'll be a little bit of a gamble, because if you did it and then suddenly you had a cold snap, you could damage that, because you're going to have really tender cell tissue in this graft union for a few weeks until they really get healed up. But Yeah, I'd try it.
Mhm.
You're not really out anything except a little time. This, I need to follow up on this discussion because there's what we're talking about here is something I'm going to stress a lot to you. You need to protect these things. A young apple tree is everybody's favorite candy. Rabbits, voles, deer, you name it. Woodchucks. um, so you plant them out without protection, and you might as well just throw them on the burn pile. So we'll stress that. You'll hear this more than once in the next 2 days, because this is vitally important to being successful with this process. And if you're not going to protect them, if you have no way to protect them, we're wasting a lot of time. I've done it myself. I'm no, this is experience talking.
Lindsay, I have a question from someone asking, once you soak the rootstock, do you have to graft right away? Or if you're interrupted, can you rewrap them in paper and start again in a few days?
Rewrap, no problem. These aren't as tender as you think. Here, I don't have a bucket here. This one's laying on. Now I don't want them to dry out and get crispy. I should slide that back in the bag. But the soaking is just, they're well hydrated now. They can go back in the bag. It's just a method to try to keep them from drying out while you're working on them.
Right. We only have 5 minutes left. So again, if the questions that you have are about planting, taking care of the trees longer term, we'll get to that tomorrow. If there are any other questions about the physical grafting, go ahead and put those in the chat now. And meanwhile, Lindsay, we do have a lot of people asking what to do immediately after grafting, and we will talk about that a little bit in the knife coaching, but do you want to just give us a quick overview? I should also say, check your email, and we will, or you will see that there is an after grafting care sheet that will give you some really good pointers there too.
All right, here I printed mine out, but this is that after grafting care sheet. It's pretty specific. The first thing is wrap them back up in the paper and bedding that we put in there. I like to again kind of squeeze the air out of here and tie this shut up at the top. Hopefully my graft unions are inside the poly. You want a humid environment in there. Drying out at this point is not a good thing. So you can seal this up. There's enough moisture around the root, and then it's temperature. You want these to be cool. And I have a thing in here about starting out the first few days of this process at a warmer temperature, like below, I think I say below 45. I checked this morning on the way out the door, my garage is right at 45. My root cellar is also at 45. So I've got a lot of room for these things, but your refrigerator will work if it's kept at 36, 38, something like that, 40, you're in good shape. That's what these want. They're not going to be molding at those temperatures. And what we have during this storage time, when we've made a graft union, if there's any kind of airspace, and we're talking microscopic here, molecular, what happens is the cut surfaces start to produce callus tissue, and those callus tissues have to fill the whole void. So the cleaner we make this cut, the better. Once that void is full of callus tissue, the cells actually differentiate, form vascules, and connect the two sides so the two parts of the plant can live, support each other. So this is what's happening while you're storing these. And you know, at 34, you don't want to freeze them at this point. At 34, that callus tissue is gonna develop slower than it does at 45 or 48 even, you know, somewhere in there. So I like to try to start out a little warm for 4 or 5 days and then cool them off. In fact, really and truly, I'm lucky because I've got this really damp root cellar and I can put them in there and I don't have to manage the moisture. Sealed up in this bag is kind of the same thing. They're in their own little environment in there. So, but that's written out pretty clearly on this sheet. Again, you've got Jamie's email. If you are confused by any of it, let us know. But that's the first step. Once you've stored them for 2, 3, 4 weeks, I've done grafts where I've had them in the root cellar for 2 months before I planted them out. As long as they're not molding or leafing out, we're good there.
Right. Well, thank you so much. We are at 10:30 and I do have to end this session because we have some knife coaching sessions that start already. I should say 10:30 our time. We have knife coach sessions that start already in 15 minutes. So I do need to end this, but thank you all for being here. Thanks for your wonderful questions. Hopefully we will see, I know we'll see some of you later today for your knife coaching sessions, and hopefully we'll see all of you tomorrow when we talk about tree care. Again, you have Jamie's email if there are questions we didn't get to today. Hopefully we'll get to them tomorrow, but if there's anything left, feel free to email. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.